In December 2016, barely a month after the election, Kanye West meets with Donald Trump at Trump Tower, emerging briefly and apparently after he'd gone missing for some time to endorse our worst fears, which had already come true, were in the process of becoming true, or were so long already true that they devised a different plan altogether. We all lived among a thrilling prose. That is, we weren't exactly a part of what was happening, but we were more than extras, concerned with our own private celebrity, undermining our failures and simultaneously holding ourselves in the highest esteem. We wrote for dozens of pages about what it felt like to be real, to know ourselves this fully, and to be alive at this time, which is, of course, to know the other side of the room. The fury required to knock people down, curse them out, or simply punch at the air meaningfully, but in a manner that distracts and instills fear in many, if not most.
The American stage has been enriched by a number of vital plays from the pens of black playwrights. Amen Corner by James Baldwin, Ossie Davis's Pearly Victorious, The Dutchman by Leroy Jones, and perhaps the most universal of all, Lorraine Hansberry's touching Raisin in the Sun. In this key scene, we see Mama, a strong Southern matriarch, struggling to understand her son's changing values now that they live in a hostile northern city.
Kanye West, in media res and with little fanfare, finally goes full circle, out and away, as if on some different level or plane of the parabola, completely done with the guise of the sort of theorist of old who famously called out George W. Bush for not caring about black people, into someone to which George Bush himself might be disgusted. Which is not to say much given the variety and gall of Bush's misdeeds, lest we forget and make the mistake of being generous when we compare it to our current situation.
And job creations are everything. But I think, we're talking about really what entrepreneurship really looks like.
When I'm writing this sentence quoting Kanye West calling out George W. Bush, I keep it free of quotation marks as if to sharing, endorse, paraphrase, actually phrase, and bellow this sentiment, true as it is both then and now, no matter what they say about how bad things will get, or have been, or once were. George Bush doesn't care about black people, perhaps at this point not literally, but as a representation of George Bush, or of an aged whiteness. This entity cannot help but keep describing its apathy in the form of endless attempts to take away space. I spend most of my early 30s defending Kanye West from various detractors here and abroad, online and in real life. In real life, Kanye West disguises himself against these same attacks by producing one of the coldest streaks of recorded music in recent or any memory. Beginning much earlier in my 20s with The College Dropout, his is a kind of synthesis of so-called backpack tendencies that influence both his lyrics and production, and the sort of braggadocio that comes with spending time with Jay-Z. As an MC, West begins as capable, interesting mostly for his candor. As the son of a professor, however, he is, in spite of the record's title, a very good student of those around him, the aforementioned Jay-Z, Cameron, Common, and takes mostly the best qualities of these and others and applies it to his own emotionality. I begin listening to Kanye West when I am in graduate school in Providence and discover a kinship in terms of my own emotionality, ethos, and ego. Kanye West evinces an honesty that is initially hard to articulate and later simply hard to take. Divided as it is between the distance to our own similarly complex feelings and the ego's tendency to protect and deflect with sex or materialism or drugs or drink. After graduate school, I tried to move to California, and when this does not work out, I moved to Texas. At this point in the chronology, I am in possession of one graduate degree, though this guarantees me little more than a position as a cashier at a pizza place.
Closed-minded folks, you know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear, but it's like this, the South got something to say. That's all I got to say.
How, Sway? Take a few steps back to go. Why don't you empower yourself and don't need them and do it yourself?
How, Sway? Walt Disney,
back,
Nike. You ain't got the answers, man. Now, who's going to be the Medici family and stand up and let me create more? Or do you want to marginalize me till I'm out of my moment?
Or why don't you empower yourself and don't need them and do it yourself?
How, Sway?
Take a few steps back to go.
You ain't got the answers, man.
I become obsessed with the band from Norway, Serena Manish, a sound-alike in the best sense of the phrase of My Bloody Valentine. And when this does not work, I revert to Nirvana and then to Kanye West. In 2015, I am invited to present a talk at a series of talks and elect to write a kind of screenplay describing the complicated experience of listening to Kanye West. I decide to film the screenplay by compiling scenes of various kinds of triumph and distress, dug out of the archive that I have, with no real sense of purpose, been compiling during my spare time. Wanting to put some distance between myself and this feeling, I asked the curator to help me find a woman with a British accent, from England or otherwise capable of faking this heritage, to lend the material an authority and distance. I present the video to a room of white people at 356 Mission in downtown Los Angeles, and when the talk is over, I go home and cry. Later, I show this same video to a slightly more sympathetic audience in New York. This New York is different from the New York that I knew in my 20s. For one, I barely now have a day job, thanks to a fellowship, and so spend a good deal more time walking around listening to music.
With the breach of 3 levees protecting New Orleans, the landscape of the city has changed dramatically, tragically, and perhaps irreversibly. There's now over 25 feet of water where there was once city streets and thriving neighborhoods.
I hate the way they portray us in the media. If you see a black family, it says they're looting. See a white family, it says they're looking for food, and you know it's been 5 days because most of the people are black. And even for me to complain about, I would be a hypocrite because I've tried to turn away from the TV because it's too hard to watch. I've even been shopping before even giving a donation. So now I'm calling my business manager right now to see what is the biggest amount I can give, and just to imagine if I was down there, and those are my people down there. So anybody out there that wants to do anything that we can help with the setup, the way America is set up to help the poor, the black people, the less well off as slow as possible. I mean, this is Red Cross is doing everything they can. We already realize a lot of the people that could help are at war right now, fighting another way, and they've given them permission to go down and shoot us.
And subtle, but in even many ways more profoundly devastating, is the lasting damage to the survivors' will to rebuild and remain in the area. The destruction of the spirit of the people of southern Louisiana and Mississippi may end up being the most tragic loss of all.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
One collector, surprised I am in Los Angeles to read poems
And job creations are everything.
at a
But I think,
nonprofit
we're
art
talking about
institution.
really what
when
entrepreneurship
I suppose
really looks
I should
like.
be perpetually reflecting on Dr. King in between mixing colors in my studio on 125th. Reminds me of how lucky I am, or how lucky I should feel. It's complicated, I want to say. Later, I regret not saying as much when I am confronted by a board member in the orbit of the institution funding this very different experience of New York. who tells me he wishes I'd done a better job, and that he and the other members of this board scarcely understood what I was going for, and that, of course, this is the perfect time to reveal this criticism. In the middle of a gala supporting this same institution, in between courses.
Those stories tonight, December 20th, 1991.
The mayor of your town proposes a radical experiment. His goal is to improve racial harmony in his virtually all-white town, but he has hardly any minorities to work with. His solution? Recruit minorities to move into the city, seek them out, guarantee them jobs. But will familiarity breed harmony or contempt?
Take a few steps back to go.
You ain't got the answers, man. You ain't got the.
The pen is mightier than the sword. Now, surely you've heard that quotation before, but perhaps you never really thought a lot about what it means. And as it's been said before, the greatest eloquence and the most persuasive words are frequently provoked by anger, oppression, and anguish. Small wonder, then, that black writers have made some of the most important contributions to contemporary American literature. Each had something important to say, and each found an indelible way to say it. One of the monumental figures in contemporary American literature was a Joplin, Missouri man named Langston Hughes. Hughes was a poet and a novelist and the winner of many prizes and much acclaim. But he will be best remembered as the man who took the frustration and the humor, the anguish and the joy, indeed the actual life of the poor, and made their voices heard throughout the world.
In 2015, I am invited to present a talk at a series of talks and elect to write a screenplay describing the complicated experience of listening to Kanye West. I decide to film the screenplay by compiling scenes of various kinds of triumph and distress.
Take a few steps back to go. Why don't you empower yourself and don't need them and do it yourself? Take a few steps back.
You ain't got the answers, man. You ain't got the answers. You ain't got the answers. You ain't got the answers. Halfway. You ain't halfway. You ain't back.
Inkjet, Zardoz, Scratch Off, the best of Sam and Dave necessitate a clarity fulfilled only in the instant of exiting other feeling. The screen is a composite image of several screens, explaining these as they may entail a conversation. Yassine Bey explains why he left the US. I describe the theme from Ernest Borgnine. I tell my driver, just fuck me up, fam, and take me anywhere besides LaGuardia. He asks me what I am doing in New York, and when I tell him, he begins to describe his own experience with acid jazz. He had been outside of Tower Records when it started raining one summer, when he was living with his folks after he declared bankruptcy. He went into Tower Records having neither the will or $6 to buy an umbrella, and when he went up to the listening station, the only one left open was the Brand New Heavies, a band he still somewhat admired, if only for making him forget that day how late he was going to be.
Cut. You gotta get the real shit. The boy over there got a
10,000 officers pass. We go down a side road to avoid the commotion of the vice president's motorcade when the GPS tells us to proceed to the route. We proceed to the route, but then backtrack several times, believing we have seen people we know from previous occasions. The theme of these and other themes, sculptural disregard, that is, a state of sculpture that has at once attracted a parallel body in its space. But then the body doesn't yet know what to do or even that it has been impressed with such a task. So much has been made of just how often his name came up during the plot points of the conversation. Of course, most of the time undermines every device and then lands you in a field behind the mobile, convinced on every level you had not been here before, though your cohort insist you are mistaken. So stand the caravels in death, preserved in towering bonnets, the plans of which in themselves constitute many potential disasters, requiring, in fact, a covering of their own, a similarly shaped vitrine with commentary by a squat and goggled attendant, also with problems of his own, demanding one's attention via a series of presentations during which he thought of the response more appropriate to winning the conversation, which had much to do with remembering less obvious examples for his case, little to do with bringing up he could now live there anymore. At first, this talk was going to be about Aretha Franklin. Then it was going to be about Etta James. The depth and weight and odds and means of guiding you toward an understanding.
I'm going to be in bed with Denzel Washington. No, I'm just joking.
Where you going to be in 10 years?
Hopefully, well, no. I will be in New York making major motion pictures for foreign and American films. You know?
But it's like this, though. I'm tired of folks, you know what I'm saying? The closed-minded folks, you know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear it, but it's like this, the South got something to say. That's all I got to say.
The depth and weight and odds and means of guiding you towards an understanding of both their voices are worth noting in any case. While the most commonplace understanding is one of a particularly charged connection with the soul, one's own, or one that is devoted or spurned, or God or metropolis crumbling,
and the magician slams his hand down over one of the three objects. And usually the magician is fine.
It is the voice as an instrument, semblance and practical advantage, in a league of similarly unassuming advantages that can equal or overthrow our common gestures. The crux of her embrace of...
But it's like this, though. I'm tired of folks, you know what I'm saying? The closed-minded folks, you know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear it, but it's like this, the South got something to say. That's all I got to say.
The crux of her embrace of a certain social order is located upon the usual reasons for taking great pains, for requiring errant tones where silence used to be. We talk or start to talk about Stevie Wonder channeling God for a certain number of years during the 70s. Revering our own underlying skepticism of this proposition, or at least the part related to religion. We respect the ineffable in music and our idea of others actively pursuing a faith because we are convinced we relate or could someday relate to the ineffable in our own small and palpable way. I was going to confine this lecture to the thirsty dust and the large feeling by who knows what matters.
You ain't got the answers, man. Halfway.
Take a few steps back.
You ain't got the answers, man.
By
Halfway. Take a few steps back.
What matters.
You ain't got the answers, man.
What matters to the dead. By the dim monitors and the transcript with additional vocals by guilty conscience, guilt by association.
You ain't got the answers. You ain't got the answers. You ain't been doing the education. You ain't been doing the education.
Calm down.
You don't have the answers though. Because you trying to give me advice about something. You ain't got the answer. You ain't spent $13 million of your own money trying to empower yourself.
I start to talk about Beyonce and then Kanye West in defense of Kanye West. I begin going through the motion of punching a man at a dinner party when he expands on his opinion of Bound 2, when I ask him to explain what he means when he says Kanye is a clown. I think of being allowed into the condition of absurdity and its antecedents, mediocrity and boredom at the prospect of the everyday. I wonder at the more appropriate reaction in the course of the conversation when indignation must be hidden as most emotion must be hidden in the bulk of social exchange. I want to say that Kanye West is nothing if not consistent in publicly making a space in both himself and his surroundings for a third or even fifth place of suggestion, of the ridiculous, the sporadic, and unconventionally rational, who designed the pamphlet, who prescribed the analogy, who landed it hands-free, who invented the concept of a restaurant so secret that it was dressed as an establishment of another variety, usually traditional fast food, but sometimes a dumpling place or an Indian place, and when you went in, you ordered everything off menu, who enthralled the habitual, who talked through the entire film, who described the entire film as it was happening, as it related to his own conceptions of disguise. I watch all of the first 4 seasons of Love and Hip Hop, including the reunion shows, because I'm tired of hearing people reference the show and having no idea what they're talking about. Instead of watching a few clips on YouTube, I am a completist, and so watch, or really mostly listen, when I am color correcting a video I am making while in residence at the museum. All of this has an effect on me, as all things in large and nearly unfettered doses can have an effect, such that I start to feel like an even more vindictive person, and one without the release valve of a reunion show to ease any of the tension. In some well-lit barracks in another part of America, Kanye West is counting off a similarly diverse list of grievances, and like the public rants, when I hear about them the next day, throughout the years, I give him the benefit of the doubt in taking up people's time, though in doing so, ensuring a temporary release for his frustrations, that this is the price of the ticket until the commentary, such as it was, became too ridiculous, and I could no longer defend Kanye West.
Vital plays from the pens of black playwrights. Amen Corner by James Baldwin.
Mostly this started with Ben Carson, and it brings us up to present day.
The Dutchman by Leroy
There are
Jones.
certain lapses in the timeline and the repetition of one scene, so as to give equal screen time to both possibilities, that it was possible to listen to Kanye West, given how recently his most egregious infractions had occurred, and if it was possible to separate this from our current reality, and so after several months of not listening to Kanye West, I took it upon myself to listen to the bulk of all of his catalog, excluding in this exercise for the sake of brevity and doing myself a little less harm, most of 808s and Heartbreak and parts of Watch the Throne. Kanye West eventually withdraws from public after a series of promotions related to the release of his most recent studio album, The Life of Pablo, which includes a series of fashion shows and a release party at Madison Square Garden. Though some of West's mounting trauma must also be attributed to his wife being robbed at gunpoint shortly before this. On a tour that will eventually be shortened, in a series of events that seem now as banal as they were fantastic, West is, as ever, consistent in his insistence on being heard, or at least making sure we are indeed aware of who we are listening to. His discourse, like the many modes of his work as a producer, is diverse in its influences, though focused in validating a distinctly singular vision of a person speaking. This is what I tell myself, what we always tell ourselves about certain behaviors, that they, to the extent that it doesn't outwardly or even inwardly harm others, have the right. The right being not quite the right phrase to describe the fact of the platform itself. It is a privilege to do and say certain things within this position, on this platform, but the reality of this scarcely existing for some means that we must contend with both the unfairness of this disparity and the outlandishness that may occur when we are as present as we are listening and responding in kind. I defend Kanye West until he destroys all credibility by asserting, like the contrarian response to a much smaller nuisance, his affinity for Ben Carson and then Donald Trump. I feel betrayed for having defended his less radical positions, and yet also disappointed in myself for allowing this permissiveness to spin things so out of control. I know that West has agency, but blame myself, or the representation of myself, as part of this system that allowed and encouraged him to flourish. This system, combined with everyday racism, systemic racism, and that one terrible lady in HR who is always on her bullshit about showing you your ID before you get your check, while not nearly as detrimental as all of the above, is, essentially unbearable in combination. I consider my own disappointment and how much it would take for me to regress to a version of being under one spell or another, to succumb to certain harder drugs, to marry into bad luck, and what it would take for me to give in when all of this became too much.
Then you wrote a book too, then, right? You got a book with blood on it, huh? You Satan, huh? Who created your ass, Satan? Who created
I want to say, I want to believe, we all want to say that I am sympathetic, but can't imagine an apocalypse that would cause me to abandon my principles, and in such a spectacular way, except to save a loved one.
So you know I ain't worried.
But it's like this, though. I'm tired of folks, you know what I'm saying? Them closed-minded folks, you know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and don't nobody want to hear it, but it's like this, the South got something to say. That's all I got to say.
Halfway. Take a few steps back to go. Why don't you empower yourself and don't need them and do it yourself?
Halfway.
Take
Walt Disney,
back,
Nike. You ain't got the answers, man. Now, who's gonna be the Medici family and stand up and let me create more? Or do you want to marginalize me till I'm out of my moment?
Or why don't you empower yourself and don't need them and do it yourself?
Halfway.
Take a few steps back to go.
You ain't got the answers, man.
At first, this talk was going to be about Lil Yachty and Lil Uzi Vert, and to a lesser degree, Chance the Rapper. Then it was going to be about Kanye West. I wanted to talk about happiness or black joy and what this entails in one scenario versus how antagonism fuels a good part of hip-hop, how the battle was key in defining certain movements, and how this animosity is a productive one, and it's basically physical, like the euphoria that comes from exercise, but also about defining a position in which to produce material, which is to say insist on happiness or the representation of flexing for the benefit of a loved one or for the gram, for as long as they go along with my instructions and know the words to the song. George Bush doesn't care about black people. Barbara Bush cannot conceive of a life that is any different from this hurricane. I am enamored of any feeling other than the one preventing me from putting my foot up someone's ass. And more than anything, just want a reliable device with which to create the dictation, without the sense of spoken word overriding every other cadence, so common as so many earlobes, hot buttered and swept up in many shades of head wrap, a station parallel to ours, with less convincing actors subsisting on that public trust, an entire corollary emotion, and the surrounding fictitious universe that might treat our depression as its own.
I hate the way they portray us in the media. If you see a black family, it says they're looting. If you see a white family, it says they're looking for food. And you know it's been 5 days because most of the people are black. And even for me to complain about, I would be a hypocrite because I've tried to turn away from the TV because it's too hard to watch. I've even been shopping before even giving a donation. So now I'm calling my business manager right now to see what is the biggest amount I can give, and just to imagine if I was down there, and those are my people down there. So anybody out there that wants to do anything that we can help with the setup, the way America is set up to help the poor, the black people, the less well off as slow as possible. I mean, Red Cross is doing everything they can. We already realize a lot of the people that could help are at war right now, fighting another way, and they've given them permission to go down and shoot us.
And subtle, but in even many ways more profoundly devastating, is the lasting damage to the survivors' will to rebuild and remain in the area. The destruction of the spirit of the people of southern Louisiana and Mississippi may end up being the most tragic loss of all.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.